Well, guys, listen. We're in Isaiah chapter 13 or 14, right? And what I want to do is there's no sense in belaboring these chapters. Basically, here's the big picture. You just had 12 chapters of God saying, "I'm going to really spank the bottom of my own sons. They rebelled against me. They've revolted against me. They've apostatized from me, and you know there's a consequence to rejecting God, and that's His own sons. Okay, I put that in air quotes because what we're talking about is Israel. Israel, one nation, is under two, uh, or is divided into two kingdoms: a northern kingdom called Israel and a southern kingdom called Judah. Okay, and God says, you know, it's time for you to have your rear ends spiritually spanked. And so he's going to do that by the other nations around Israel. Notice that some things never change. Okay. Just like today, Israel is fighting all the nations around them. It's the same way in the Old Testament. Israel was, to survive, they had to fight all the nations around them. All the nations have always hated Israel. Okay. And it might be because God promised to bless them in a way that He never promised to bless other nations. That doesn't mean blessings didn't come upon other nations. It just means that God never promised to do that. So in chapters 13 all the way through 23, God's going to now move from Israel, that is the two kingdoms, to all the nations around Israel and saying, I'm going to take care of them too. Okay. So that's what's happening in these next 11 chapters. Any questions? Here's what I think you can really gain from this is simply take note of, okay, God's going to judge. The first one is Babylon. Well, why is He judging them? And so you look at the why, and all of a sudden you're saying, "Oh my goodness, uh, okay, that could be applicable to us today." So don't we ought not to think that we're going to get away from God's discipline and judgment just because you know we've believed in Jesus or we follow Him in some way, but not fully. And by the way, nobody follows Jesus fully. Just this fully devoted. What is it? Tell me what that phrase is again. Fully devoted followers of Christ. Nobody's there yet, guys. You may want to be there, but there's a lot in your life that you haven't surrendered. So the bottom line is that's the goal from the rest of our lives is to find those areas that I'm not fully devoted to Christ and give them back, give them up. But to think that I've made the cut, nobody's made that cut yet. Okay. So the first is called in chapter 13. Well, actually, it's two chapters, 13 and 14. It's on Babylon, the burden on Babylon or about Babylon. God is to bring other nations against Babylon. Babylon is the big dog. Okay. They're in control here, but God's going to bring other nations against them. Now, this is when is Isaiah writing, guys?
This is pre-exile,
Yes, but
800, 700 BC.
yeah, about 750 to 700. Okay, so that's when he's focusing his ministry. That's when he's writing. So when does Babylon get defeated? Okay, Babylon's going to get defeated somewhere around about roughly 540. Yeah, that's 200 years later.
Is
How
that
many times?
who
How
defeats
many?
them? Is that the Medes that defeat them?
Yes, well, the Medes and Persians, because the Persians already defeated the Medes, and now the Persians are coming down and uh, is going to defeat Babylon. And remember, that was going to be Cyrus and Darius in the book of Daniel. So that's going to happen in 200 years. So can you not understand what it's just like America? America gives us promises and blessings, and here 200 years later, we're falling away from ever even knowing God at all. And God says, judgment's coming. You know, you're not going to walk away from me without discipline. So notice in verses 3 and verse 5, God uses war to execute his anger. He says in verse 3, I have commanded my sacred ones. Notice what he's calling the nations around Babylon. I have even called my mighty warriors, my proudly exalting ones, to execute my anger. Then in verse 5, they are coming from a far country, from the furthest horizon. That's your Medo-Persians. The Lord and his instruments of indignation to destroy the whole land. So God uses other nations to carry out his discipline, his anger over sin. Now, how does that relate to Romans 1:18, guys? Remember what Romans 1:18 says? Romans 1:18 talks about God's anger is presently being revealed from heaven upon all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men. Okay, it's a present thing. God's anger is revealed in this life. I don't know that there's any passage that tells us that God's anger is also revealed in the afterlife. That's an assumption. We assume that hell is an expression of God's anger upon sinful man. But instead of assuming that, we need a chapter and verse for that. It may be, and I think so, that God has a totally different purpose than simply trying to express his anger upon sin at that time. So, in verses 3, 4, and 5, notice how Medo-Persia is described. Now, guys, now we're talking about people way outside the line of promise, right? Outside of God's chosen nation. Consecrated, called, the Lord's instruments of indignation, an army for battle, coming from a far country, from the end of heaven. That's amazing. So when God wants to use anyone, that person becomes an instrument of his righteous indignation. That's an amazing thing. So in chapter 13, verses 6 to 16, the day of the Lord is going to be talked about. And guys, I want to be the first to admit that, sometimes it's really difficult to understand exactly upon whom the passage is being spoken. So it could be the people immediately during the prophet's lifetime, or 200 years later, or it could be even future. So I'm suggesting here in verses 6 to 8 that the day of the Lord is looking for Babylon's immediate defeat. So that's 200 years in the future. Destruction comes from the Almighty, verse 6. Devastation to be fearful, verses 7 and 8. So it's going to be a bad day for Babylon. But in verses 9 to 16, the day of the Lord seems to relate to even a future time. Now, here are the reasons that I give for that, okay? The elements in the passage that are yet to be fulfilled. To make the land desolate, all of Babylon to be desolate, to exterminate its sinners from it. Got any sinners over in Babylon? It's like, do we have any sinners in the church? Yeah, we got plenty of sinners in the church too. To extinguish the celestial lights. Whoa! Now when they're dealing with the cosmos. To punish the world, not just Babylon. That's verse 11. To put an end to arrogance. Got any pride anywhere in the Middle East or the Far East? And to make mankind scarce. This seems to be, that phrase makes me think of the tribulation, where 3 out of 4 people get killed during the tribulation. Making man scarce. Okay. So apparently, verses 9 to 16, I'm suggesting may be a description of the future tribulation time where Babylon is the symbol of all of God's enemies, and they're all judged during the tribulation. So, therefore, Babylon's defeat by Medo-Persia is a foreshadowing of the Messiah's defeat of the coming world ruler. Interestingly enough, that world ruler may actually be from Persia/Assyria. So there's a likeness there. How do you know anybody remember the passage that tells us that the coming world ruler, the person we call Antichrist, which is a bad, it's a bad identification. The Antichrist is actually the false prophet. The coming world ruler is the head honcho. That's the big bad guy. You know where he comes from? Micah chapter 5, verses 3 through 7 says he comes from Assyria. So all this, you can see how the immediate prophecies over Babylon and their coming defeat and God's judgment upon Medo-Persia, Babylon, Assyria, it all weaves together in an interesting way. So in verses 17 to 22 of chapter 13, Babylon's judgment to be accomplished by the Medes. Okay, notice verse 17, behold, I'm going to stir up the Medes against Babylon. So this isn't conjecture. God's very clear about this. The Medes at this point have already conquered Persia. Okay, and that's Persia, remember, is simply present-day Iran. So when you see Persia in the Old Testament, you're talking about Iran. The Medes will kill babies and children as well as adults, verse 18. That sounds familiar, doesn't it? Nations have long sought to exterminate other nations. This isn't new with Hamas and Gaza. Not new at all. So Babylon's destruction likened to Sodom and Gomorrah's. Well, one day you're having fun and the next day you're seeing fire and brimstone fall down from heaven. Yikes. That's enough to make you totally delirious. You don't know where to run because it all seems bad. So the destruction will be quick, be thorough. just like raining down fire and brimstone was on Sodom and Gomorrah. The women will be raped and killed, verses 16 and 19, just like Hamas did to Israel in 2023. Babylon never to be inhabited again. Now, I take that to be larger than just the city of Babylon. Okay. I can't get more specific than that because I just don't know. Babylon never to be inhabited again. That's verses 20 and 22. Now, this is a prophecy on the ancient city of Babylon, even though the beginning of that was not fulfilled until 200 years later. Babylon's king to be destroyed, chapter 14. Now, here's where we have some differences. Many of the people that you've heard speak on Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28 want to use this to be a picture of Satan, God's judgment upon Satan. Okay, I'm going to suggest that it doesn't fit the context, doesn't fit the flow of the book, and there's nothing that can't be understood in as far as a description of a physical king that reigned upon the earth, namely Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon. So, but here's a side note. Look at verse 1, Isaiah 14:1. Notice that Israel is chosen for a second time. I just suggest that you think that through. Maybe the whole concept of being chosen doesn't relate to what we describe and discuss as salvation or justification or any salvific concept whatsoever. Being chosen is simply God says, I want you to serve me in this way at this time. That's being chosen. See, we got to clear it up of all the, what can I say, the tradition that's been piled on top of it. So in verse 4, we start a taunt against the king of Babylon. Now, in verses 7 to 22, I'm suggesting that a human being is being described here and not an angel. Notice verse 7, the earth is at rest. Okay? Well, notice how that's contrary, that when Satan fell, what did he do? He began to terrorize the earth, right? So we're not looking at a spiritual thing. We're looking at the physical kingdoms on the earth. The earth is at rest. Verse 8, the trees are undisturbed. That tells you that the building projects have ceased. Sheol wants to meet him. Okay, this is where, Brett, you're going to have to jump in here, but I'm not sure Sheol is ever a description of hell per se, but rather the place of the dead. Okay, Sheol wants to meet him. So the place of the dead humans, that is in that place, many people want to meet, receive, and probably kick the rear end of the king that's coming down because he so terrorized other nations. Okay, look at verse 10. This king that we're talking about has become like other dead kings. Surely this affirms the humanity of the king that he's talking about. Okay. Verse 11, his body is eaten by worms. Well, it's impossible for worms to eat spiritual beings, as far as we know. The spirit of man will continue shall live as long as God sustains that life, but nothing's going to destroy it. Look at verse 12 and verse 15. He who kills so many is now killed. Angelic beings can't be killed, can't be destroyed. They can be imprisoned, and God has done that in 2 Peter chapter 2, verses 4 and 5. So God has already imprisoned certain angels, okay? Fallen angels that we call demons or unclean spirits. In verses 13 and 14, he's filled with arrogance. Now, of course, this fits with Satan. It was out of pride that Satan fell, out of pride that he, or through pride, he deceives people upon the earth to follow him. But it does not identify this person as Satan. Just because, hey, he was like that, so have been many, many other people. Now in verse 16, notice that this king of Babylon, he's called a man. This affirmation ought to be enough to decide the case, for certain, in my opinion. Okay. He was a world conqueror, verses 16 and 17. Again, of course, this fits Satan because he's the ruler of this whole world. The New Testament tells us, John 14:30. Okay. But look at verses 18 and 20. This king was cast out of his tomb. Never said about Satan. This is applicable only to a dead human king. And then in verses 21 and 22, this king has sons. This can't be a description of Satan, since God imprisoned in Tartarus all the evil angels who procreated at the time of the flood.
But Dale, do you think this could be the beast, the Antichrist he's referring to?
No. I think it fits him. Okay. And so if we could say that this is about the king of Babylon, the historical king of Babylon, then the coming world ruler, okay, is going to be a type of that. So
There's
things
a lot
that he
of
said,
similarity here, yeah.
yeah, it's so you almost all the things that are said here about the king of Babylon can fit that coming world ruler in the book of Revelation. That's a good question, Tom. Thanks. So now in verse 14, the end of verse 14, we have the burden on Assyria. Wars are decreed by the will of God. Look at verse 24. Now, guys, I got to warn you, verses 24 and 25 and 26 are kind of classic verses that are used to prove all kinds of things spiritually. It's mainly it's to demonstrate God's sovereignty and man's responsibility, and how God is so sovereign that, man can't do anything on his own that's good. So verse 24 says, the Lord of hosts has sworn, saying, surely, just as I have intended, so it has happened. And just as I planned, so it will stand. Well, that sounds like sovereignty, doesn't it? And yet notice that all that we've read up to this point is how God has called ungodly nations to discipline his people and the rest of the world as well. So no, we're not talking about God's sovereignty in that sense. Look at verse 25. Assyria to be defeated in the land of Israel. So he says, I'm going to decree and plan to break Assyria in my land, and I will trample him on my mountains. This is probably a reference to the Assyrians' defeat in 701 BC. Okay. One of my favorite passages that's coming up in the book of Isaiah. One little tiny angel is going to come down and is going to slay 185 Assyrian soldiers. Now I got to ask you, what do you think those that got away? What do you think those that got away, if they had any glimpse of this warrior spirit that God sent? What do you think they thought?
So is this a Syrian ruler? Is this how do you say it? Sennacherib? Uh,
No, this is God sending an angel to
okay.
defeat Syria, who has surrounded Jerusalem.
Who was the king of Assyria at this time?
Just a minute, I think I can tell you. This is during the reign of Shalmaneser. You just had Sargon and Sennacherib crushed after the death of Tiglath-Pileser, okay, in the reign of Shalmaneser. So that's the best answer I can give you. Those are the names that you're going to find scattered throughout the book of Isaiah. Okay. So notice that in verses 26 and 27, the nations around Israel defeated one aspect of God's eternal plan. By eternal, I mean at this time. This was part of God's plan at this time. So note the change in the subject matter from verses 24 and 25 to verse 26 of Isaiah 14. And now in verse 26 and 27, it says, this is the plan devised against the whole earth. This is the hand stretched out against all the nations. For the Lord of hosts has planned. Who can frustrate it? And as for his outstretched hand, who can turn it back? And that, of course, there is a certain way to ask a question while you're making a positive statement. So who can frustrate it? No one. Who can turn it back? No one. Okay. God is sovereign in that sense. When God plans something and he's ready to carry it out, you're not going to stop it. So notice, though, in the immediate context, even those wild, all-inclusive terms, the whole earth, all the nations, in the context, this plan is against the nations described in the immediate chapters. And so you'll see that the west is Philistia. The east is Moab. The north is Damascus. The south is Ethiopia. Those are the nations around Israel that God's going to judge for their sin and especially for how they treated Israel. So he picks up the very first one, going to the east, the burden of Philistia. Again, probably the chapter break should begin at verse 26 here of chapter 14. It should start chapter 15. The rod that struck you is broken. What he's saying is the enemy that destroyed Philistia will be defeated. But Philistia will still be destroyed by famine. With every war, there comes decimation by famine. Because the earth is just ripped up. Yeah, Paul?
Philistia, this is the land of the Philistines, right?
Yes, on the coast.
Which is sort of like the Gaza Strip. I mean, it was down on the southwest coast.
Yep, okay. Exactly.
There's kind of a overarching pattern here. So Israel runs off the rails. God assigns Assyria the task of judging Israel, the northern 10 tribes. So Assyria does that. And then Babylon, God sends Babylon, conquers Assyria, judges them, and conquers Judah. Okay, so they did what God wanted. And
And then
now
Medo
the
Persia comes
Persians are
in.
going to come on Babylon and judge them. And then, of course, eventually Greece, Alexander comes in and conquers the Persian Empire. It's just, I mean, I know they're in their conquering, they're doing horrific things, but I'm not sure what the kind of the big picture lesson is here about being God's conqueror.
Well, what prophet do we have in the Old Testament that is going to answer that question? Anybody? A minor prophet that tells us, the prophet says, Lord, why are you going to bring the Chaldeans in to discipline us? They are so bad. They're so cruel. They're evil. And God answers the question. He said, hey, you deserve it because you're in sin, but don't worry. I've got someone that's going to take care of them. And that's the whole thing that you're talking about. I'm going to use certain nations to discipline other nations, but then I'm going to have still further nations to discipline them. And so why would God use evil, cruel nations to discipline those that are more righteous than they? And guys, I think that whole picture is, and you need to make a note. Look up the phrase "more righteous." So we've been taught righteous is some kind of rubber stamp that, hey, you're all good to go, right? You're all righteous. But no, guess what? There are some people that are more righteous than others. We're not talking about the difference between what we call the saved and the unsaved today. We're talking about people in their relationship to God. Some people are more righteous than others. This whole idea of being justified as some kind of judicial, legal rubber stamp, of righteousness is simply not biblical. Okay? I know that's going to give a lot of people heartburn, but.
So who is the prophet that you were talking about?
Habakkuk. Little bitty chapter. Okay? Habakkuk will addresses this very question. So now, with notice in verse 14, chapter 14, verse 29, it says that a viper is going to produce a flying serpent. I'm going to suggest to you, staying in the context, who's the viper? That's Assyria. What's the flying serpent? That's the famine. The famine that's going to come through, that's going to destroy, people. Moving down to verse 30, God uses famine to finish the destruction that Assyria started. Decimated by a war or defeated in war, they're decimated by famine. To be crushed by Sargon and Sennacherib after the death of Tiglath-Pileser and the reign of Shalmaneser. Guys, don't ask me to parse that much past that. I'd have to go back and look at some old class notes. And I didn't do that. So after that, you're going to come to the burden of Moab. This is chapter 15, verse 1 through 16, chapter 16, verse 14. Notice the description of the devastation of Moab, verses 1, chapter 15, 1 to 9. It's sudden. It happens just like in a nighttime. Bam. It's humiliation. Everyone's head is bald and every beard is cut off. That's verse 2. This is a sign of mourning. When you shave your head and your beard, you're in mourning. It's grief, verse 3. Everyone is wailing, dissolved in tears. So the judgment that God's bringing on Moab is not only sudden, it's devastating. God will not give aid to Moab during this time. Look at chapter 16, 1 to 14. And by the way, this is in verse 4. This is where Corrie ten Boom finds the title for her book, A Hiding Place. Okay. So a plea to Judah for help. Verse 4, to be a hiding place to them. Israel is commanded by God to give aid to her former enemy. Okay. Now, guys, that's a real good example, I think, of Jesus teaching on loving not only, love your friends, but love your enemies. Pray for them that persecute you. In the midst of a passage on judgment, Isaiah again inserts the promise and hope of Messiah's coming to judge in righteousness. That's verse 5. You see him sprinkle these passages or verses of hope throughout all the judgment passages that he talks about. Moab's judgment is due to pride. Look at verses 6 to 12. Look at verse 6. We have heard of the pride of Moab, an excessive pride, even of his arrogance, pride, and fury. His idle boast are false. This makes me think, that Moab, maybe just a minute, let me think, I'm going blank. Judas was a little bit like Moab. I think they were both trash talkers. Okay, that's where John 6, verses 70 and 71 is talking about. When Jesus says, didn't I choose you, and yet one of you is diabolos. One of you it's either a devil or a person that speaks rashly.
A slanderer.
A slanderer. Yeah. And so notice that many people have had the same problem. If God judged the whole nation because of pride, would he do that to his people individually?
That's an interesting question. Is God working with people corporately or individually? And does it apply to the bigger group, or does it trickle down to the individual?
You ever see God judging individuals? You do, don't you? I'm just saying this looks like one of those applications for us. Every time you take away the glory that God ought to get, you basically take away the glory that you could have had in the life to come. Remember, God's a jealous God. He doesn't give his glory to anybody. So when you want to beat your chest or tell people how great you are, just remember, you can do it. But you're absolutely, while you're drawing attention to yourself, you're pushing away the positive benefits and glory that you could have had in the afterlife. So if
But
God
is Moab, was Moab one of the tribes of Israel?
no, it's It's on the eastern side of the Jordan. Remember when they were coming into the land, they had to go through Moab, Edom to get into and these guys were the ones that didn't want them to come through.
So was Moab ever part of the kingdom under David?
Now, yes, it was. David's
Okay.
kingdom was a very large kingdom, but David's kingdom never incorporated all of the land promised to Israel.
Right. But it did include Moab. Huh?
Yes, it went into Moab. Basically, is what city today? I mean, what country today?
Iraq? Huh.
No, Iraq is north, right? It's
Jordan?
Jordan. Yeah.
Okay.
So notice in verse 12, Moab's prayers are going to be futile. Many times God promises not to hear the prayers of sinners. Psalm 66:18, if anyone regards iniquity in his heart, the Lord will not hear him. John 9:31, God does not, we know. Now, this is the blind man correcting the religious leaders of Jesus' day. We know that God does not hear sinners. So, you want to have prayers answered? Clean your life up. Then go to the throne of grace. So, verses 13 and 14 in chapter 16, destruction is to begin within 3 years. This is called a short-term prophecy. So when this is fulfilled, it ought to bring you to your knees that all the other prophecies that Isaiah is giving about all the other nations, they're all going to come true. Okay. Chapter 17, you're going to have the burden against Damascus and Ephraim. Now you're going to the north. Their alliance is condemned. Now, a key thing for your study would be to notice that in these verses 1 to 6, that Damascus has a sovereignty. It's one of the very few times that the term sovereignty is used in the Bible. Okay? None of those times give the theological idea that's been developed about God's sovereignty. Hey, guys, I used to be able to tell you exactly how God was sovereign and man was responsible. And God has finally opened my eyes to say that's above your pay grade. You know, you're not able to do that. God hasn't revealed it, and it's all conjecture by man on how that works itself out. Just know God's sovereign. I don't know exactly what that means or how that works itself out, but that's why he tells me to pray about everything. Why? God can answer the prayer and intervene. But realize that I am responsible. God isn't going to somehow supersede my responsibility. So, I was once asked fairly recently by a guy who is writing a book on the character of God, about God's sovereignty. I said, you know what? It's one of those things that it's hard or impossible to explain, but you know it when you see it. A great illustration in my mind of God's sovereignty and man's responsibility is the love affair between Mary and Joseph. That was purely their choice, right? But yet they had to make that choice to have the baby that was going to be born from Mary as a ruler in line to be the Messiah. It makes me shake my head. Yeah, I don't know how God assured that union to take place, but Part of it, of course, was the fact that he showed an angel appeared to Joseph, who was going to go in the wrong direction. He said, Joseph, you don't go in that direction. You take her, your wife. So part of it was God's direct intervention that got them married. But they already loved each other. So there's man's responsibility and God's sovereignty. It's confusing. It's blurred, but it's both there. So in verses 7 to 11 in chapter 17, the judgment of the northern kingdom for idolatry. Although let me think this out. Verse 7, in the day of judgment, spirituality arises. That is, God uses trials to refine and mature people. Verse 7. How many times, remember I said that there were 5 motivation. They're more than that. That's just what I came up with. There are 5 motivations in Scripture for obedience. You guys remember what those 5 are? The first one is just who God is. The more you know who God is, the more you serve him. The more you're ready to respond, because he is the one true and living God. And he's going to judge us all one day. And that judgment will have nothing to do with whether you believed in Jesus. Okay? It's going to be according to everything that you've thought, felt, did, said, okay, by your works. So it's who God is. The more I know God, the less I sin. Look at 1 John chapter 3, verse 6. Every time you sin, God says, that's because you don't know me. If you would know me a little bit better, you wouldn't have done what you just did. 1 John 3, 6. Okay? So the first motivation for obedience is knowing God. Okay? It's the highest motivation. The second one is what God has promised us. Look at all the promises that God has given to us and how he's answered prayers, how he's done miraculous things in our lives and in other people's lives. It's an amazing thing what God has done. That should motivate us to follow after him, not just to get answers to prayer and get blessings, but that's part and parcel of the whole obedience thing. I obey God, because it's right, because of who he is, but also because he promises to bless that obedience. Okay? Thirdly, the reason that I obey God is because he promises to reward that obedience. Now, this reward is different than blessings in this life. The rewards come in the afterlife. He's going to bless me with rewards, places of service in the afterlife. I'm trying to keep from saying all the words I used to say, but rewards. Thirdly, and guys, I got to tell you, this is probably bigger in my life than the other 3. The other 3 should have just solved the problem. I should never sin because of these 3. But the 4th one, it's the one that gets my attention. He says, Taliaferro, if you do that, I'm going to have to spank your bottom. He brings discipline, a conviction of sin and discipline for those who are disobedient. And quite frankly, there are things that I haven't done in my life because I didn't want the consequence. It wasn't because I was enamored with God or that I was so, focused upon his blessings or the rewards that would come. It's because I'm scared shitless and what he's going to bring in my life. What's it say? Hebrews chapter 10, verse 31. It's a terrifying thing to fall in the hands of the living God. And if you don't believe that, then you're ignoring that motivation for holiness. And lastly, is guess what? God gave us and created us with a conscience. While it's not infallible, it's not perfect, yet it still works. And I'm not so sure that it's not the conscience that God works through to convict me and lead me. Yes, he does that by God's Spirit, but it's the conscience. I have known a man that seemed to have the largest, the most sensitive conscience in the world. You didn't have to convince him about what was right or wrong. He said, well, that's obvious. It's obvious what you should do here. So he was a little frustrating. He was so, programmed, if I could say that, by a good conscience to do the right thing. He didn't need anything else. 5 things for obedience. Okay. So when God brings the discipline, it's to refine me. It's to clean my life up. Now, guys, make a note of that verse 7. Okay. If this is the consequence of God's discipline, chastisement, punishment, even anger in this life, isn't it reasonable to think that it's probably going to be also true in the afterlife? So if there's any discipline that I need in the afterlife, it won't be because of his anger. Okay, now it's just to conform me. It's just to refine me. It's just to mature me. I think so, because there's a connection. God is immutable. If he uses trials to mature us in this life, and that's not debatable, James 1, 2 through 4 says that. He uses trials to mature me. 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 6 and 7 says that. He uses trials to refine me. Psalm 139, verses 67, 71, and 75 say that he uses trials so that I would be obedient. I'd come back to him. It's throughout the Bible. This is God's use of trials, afflictions, punishment, chastisement. And if that's his route today, why would I think in the afterlife it's different?
I don't think I know too many, probably I can count them on one hand, Christians that fear God. It's like, I know Jesus, he's my friend, I have no fear. But I fear God, I think you fear God, but what is this concept of fearing God? Moses talks about it, all the prophets talk about fearing God.
Well, I think the whole idea is that we've done within Christianity exactly what all the other religions of the world have done. We've remade God the way we want him to be. So we remade him as just a loving God. He's not a God that's going to demand righteousness and holiness. He's too loving for that. He's so compassionate that he understands. Okay? All we're now, I don't think he said it in these words. We put words in his mouth, but who was the guy? I'll think of the guy in a minute. But during the Renaissance, he says, God made man in his own image, and now man has returned the favor. See, that's why we're so off base, because we're not having our mentality molded by the Word of God, which is the revelation from God. It's what we think. And what do you call it? The Generation Z or whatever, the newest generation is going to college now. You talk about hopeless, mindless spirituality. That's uh, they have no motivation to see God in anything. Okay, and they think their interpretation of life is just as good as anybody else's.
Hey, Dale, let me bring this up. During this break, I read this book called 9 Days in Heaven, and it was a paraphrase of a lady named Marietta Davis in 1848 who fell into a coma and she couldn't be stirred. And then 9 days later, she came out of the coma and she had experienced one of these after death experiences. And she wrote a book, or actually, her pastor wrote a book called Scenes from Beyond the Grave. But as it relates to these judgments, she talks about people that she encountered and even some that she knew. And this one gal, as an example, said, when I was living, I just wanted popularity and pleasure and all these things. So then when I died, I went to a group of people in the afterlife that also wanted those things. And it was very pleasant to be with these people. But then there was a discord within me as I knew of God's holiness, and it became painful to me. So it wasn't that she was being punished. It was just she was out of tune, out of touch in her own desires. And Marietta says, even in my own desires, it became excruciatingly painful because of what was within me as I brushed up against, or as I knew of the holiness of God. So none of those people were angry with God. They acknowledged, they blessed, they were looking for a way out. And the book doesn't, unfortunately, give you a whole lot of the next story, but what it does do is really show that it's not, it's just that these people could not relate to the holiness of God because they had other impurities in their own life. And so they were in this place that was sanctioned for those kinds of people. So that's what Marietta wrote about. And like 6 months later, she died in the way and at the time that she had predicted. And she was young. She was like 21 years old, but there had been a revival and she was not prone to enter into the spiritual life. She was just thinking about it and she had this vision dream. And so, all made up. I don't know. I don't actually think so, but it was an interesting read of how these kinds of things might work.
Yeah. Well, trust me, guys, as you read the scriptures, God simply wants a people to walk with him, to get to know him, and to become like him. So Romans 8:29 says, what is the purpose of salvation? When I say salvation, let me use a different term for what's the purpose of people believing in Jesus? Okay. It's to become like Jesus. Romans 8:29. That we might be conformed to him. That's the goal of the spiritual life, becoming conformed to the image of Christ. 2 Corinthians 3:18 says the same thing. But we all behold as an image the glory of the Lord, and we become like him from glory to glory, from step to step, as we continue to look at him. The bottom line, what I'm trying to say is God is all about us being transformed into the image of his son because his son is in the image of the Father. So if I'm like Jesus, I'm like God. Okay? And that's what God's about. So the fact that we are not like that, that's why he's given the Holy Spirit to convict of sin. This is where that classic passage changes for me. Convict of sin. Why? Because they don't believe in me. We're not talking about a one-time belief. We're talking about a daily belief. You're not believing in Jesus. That's not to get you to heaven. You're not believing what he's revealed to you. That's sin. Sin, righteousness. when you go to the Father in this life, as well as in the other, you're going to have to be righteous. So I've got to stop sinning so I can be righteous, so I don't have judgment. Okay? That's really a passage all about how I'm living my life to become more conformed to the image of Christ, to know him better. All right. The last thing, Isaiah chapter 17, verses 12 to 14. Sennacherib loses 185 soldiers in a night at the hands of one single angel. Can you imagine what 72,000 angels would have done? Remember, Jesus said, hey, don't worry about this little mob here that wants the rest. If God wanted me to do this, I could call 72 legions. 12 legions, which is, I think, 72,000 angels. If one angel could do this, 72,000 could have made a mess, for sure. I love this passage. So you want to go to Isaiah 37, I think, verses 36 and 37 as well. So we'll start back next week with chapter 18. Look, we got 13, 14, 15, 16, 17 done. Hey, that's got to be some kind of record.
Hey, Dale, where was that where the angel destroys Sennacherib's army?
Isaiah 37, verses 36 and 37, I think.
37, 36.
Okay. Hey, miracles happen right before your eyes. You just don't recognize them. Thank you, guys. This has been fun. Next week, chapter 18. And now, if you want to, you can skip and we'll go cover this like we did today, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23. But you need to be reading 24 to 27. If you want some meat, you're going to choke on that, okay? That's more than you can digest. So take small bites.